Welcome everyone to today's program, which is brought to you by SpineMark Corporation. I am Robert Kurtz, moderator for the webinar. The program will begin with a presentation by Marcy Rogers of SpineMark, and then we will have a question and answer session following completion of the presentation. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Marcy will attempt to answer as many of your questions as she can during the Q&A portion of the program. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Marcy Rogers is President and CEO of SpineMark Clinical Research Organization Management, a subsidiary of SpineMark Corporation, the premier global spine service company for the development of spine centers of excellence and spine research organizations. SpineMark works with physicians, hospitals, facility companies, third-party payers, and medical manufacturers in the fields of spine, pain, orthopedic surgery, and neurosurgery. For more than 30 years, Marcy has worked with leading healthcare professionals, facilities, and medical device manufacturers to advance her goals of improving patient outcomes and satisfaction. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Marcy for today's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Rob, for that nice introduction. I'm very excited to be able to be here today to share some experiences and some information about the spine industry at present and the opportunities as well as the trials and tribulations, if you will, of taking a new device or biologic or some other piece of technology through the clinical trial process here in the United States. There are a number of issues we're going to cover today, and let's start with challenges facing innovation today, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of. Next slide, please, Rob. This is an excerpt from a paper published by Frost and Sullivan in 2008, and it describes a research strategy that we had collaborated with them on in terms of why the process exists as it is between device manufacturers and hospitals and physicians. As you can see, the whole concept of the inter-exchange of information and flow of tasks and responsibilities and influencing the outcome of a device from a device manufacturer introducing it into the space of new innovation to the actual implementation or utilization of it in a hospital or facility setting. There's a whole host of issues that must be covered, and this really is why we look towards the vertical integration of services as being optimum so that we can address not only the device issues of reimbursement and strategies and trial management and regulatory compliance, but also once going through the process, taking it into the actual utilization and measuring outcomes, determining what the revenue or the reimbursement opportunities or lack thereof are going to be. And ultimately, the reason why all of us are in this is to ultimately improve the quality of care for patients. Next slide, please, Rob. There was a very interesting article that's been resonating over the past few years, but in 2011, the New York Times was a pretty groundbreaking article about the problems of the going through the FDA for a new device or implant or biomaterial technology, and the obstacles of cost, the regulatory obstacles of trying to comply with all the reviews and the assessments of additional tests, and the fact that we were positioning ourselves here in the United States as becoming a center or a focus for manufacturers of being very, very difficult to get through the FDA, not only from a regulatory perspective, but a cost perspective. Now, this same theme has been resonating in additional articles that have been published, and now, this was the first one, but now what you're starting to see, and there have been more articles and publications around the world, is device manufacturers, because of many of the issues that we're going to highlight here on this slide, have actually started moving their operations outside the United States and developing footprints in countries like China and emerging markets and other places. The reason behind this is that the pathway for them to get through a clinical trial here, especially in the device side, and specifically focused on spine in particular, has been so costly and so long that these smaller companies did not have the resources to sustain going forward. In addition to that, the heightened scrutiny in the United States has also added another layer of complexity to this process. So what we find now is that what was written in 2011 is actually coming to fruition. Many leading devices are now commercializing outside the United States because of the scrutiny, and there are a number of companies. Spinal Kinetics, for example, is an excellent opportunity of how this was one of the companies that had to resort to this. They had a lumbar artificial disc that they were trying to take through the FDA, had a rather innovative strategy for commercializing it and finding a control against which it could be measured. They wanted to focus on the patient being the control, not a competitive procedure or device. And after a while, they were going to run out of time and ultimately out of resources. So they made the decision to start selling in Europe, and they were so successful in doing so that they've come back around now where they're looking to come back and commercialize again here in the United States because they've had such a successful experience selling abroad. There are a number of companies that have had to go the same direction, interventional spine and others. And part of it has to do with a lack of a consistent regulatory pathway. And also that with the advent of medical tourism and patient consumer education, many patients, particularly in cardiology and spine, will travel to foreign countries to be able to have this latest technology. So it's definitely a time of change and a lot of transitions going on. Next slide, please, Rob. The typical timeline for a spinal medical device company, usually is somewhere around 24 to 2 to 4 years, depending on enrollment. And you have to start with the whole process of site recruitment and qualification, orchestrating all the contracts, meeting with IRB approvals. This slide kind of takes the pathway as we follow it. Enrollment should typically last 18 months, but that's depending on where you are and the sites that you have and their ability to enroll quickly. This can be extended much, much longer. I have one company that I've been tracking for a number of years who have been in the FDA trying to get out of it for 7 years with a device that there are many predicates for already. It's a phenomenon. So you want to plan for somewhere between a 18 to 24 month kind of enrollment. Then you'll have your follow-up and then the closeout. So ideally, if you can get through this process in 3 to 4 years, you're doing really, really well. And being able to meet the demands of your resources and the commercialization strategy. Next slide, please, Rob. So what are the issues for a sponsor when he's looking for this? Well, the first and foremost is it's easy to recruit principal investigators. Everyone's always excited about the latest and greatest and new device. But when it comes down to actually quantifying how those investigators are going to be able to contribute to the trial, that's where there's a slight misstep, if you will, because it's been hard in the past to quantify actually the numbers and volumes that patients that a principal investigator can bring to the site. Obviously, you want to screen them very carefully. We have a due diligence program that we use. But investigator recruitment is pivotal to the success of the trial. The second most important part of this is being able to have the appropriate infrastructure. Clinical research coordinator is absolutely essential, and in many cases, if you don't have one, organizations will help sponsor one because they recognize the role of that person in the success. Case reporting of adverse events and the timely of those, and then all the various silos for a sponsor. How do you coordinate the regulatory with the study operations and the data management? What about reimbursement in this process? When does it phase in for them? And then patient recruitment. Next slide, please, Rob. So if you look at a vertical integration model, it's a lot easier to try and coordinate all of these tasks in a very, very efficient fashion. It can be, various silos working together. It doesn't have to be under one entity. But looking at all of the components and then proactively planning for these components, as you can see in this slide, we put reimbursement right up at the top of the list while you're thinking through regulatory, economic, and market issues. Because, as I'll discuss later, it's absolutely essential that you ferret out whatever obstacles or issues are going to come about before you, as part of the protocol process or the beginning of the regulatory process, as opposed to finishing a trial and finding out, as you'll see later, that there is no reimbursement. Next slide, please, Rob. So the value proposition, if you're able to vertically integrate, is that it's relationship building. There's a lot of cost savings, and there's also this whole element of communication that allows you to fast track, if you will, many of the essential functions of the clinical trial or the study that you're doing. Getting to market much sooner, reducing enrollment time for patients, avoiding having to redo all of your data because it was corrupted, avoiding post-market studies are all essential to the value proposition by approaching a study for a new product and getting it on schedule and on budget and in compliance in a vertically integration fashion. Next slide, please, Rob. So protocol development, what are some of the strategies that you can think about as you approach the process? Next slide, please. One thing I think I mentioned earlier, reimbursement nightmares, and the list kind of grows from here. But several companies, when they were launching their new products, met with obstacles that absolutely shut them down and in many cases inhibited their ability to be the revolutionary transformation that they had set out to be. Certainly Audit, which was developed by Oratech, was moving along very, very well. There was a lot of utilization, and suddenly Blue Cross Blue Shield decided that they were going to do a tech assessment on the product and came back with a denial of coverage. That absolutely was a very defining moment for the success of this company, and ultimately Audit was sold off and never really successfully became all that they had envisioned, Oratech had envisioned. Most significant one on this list is the Charité lumbar artificial disc, one of the greatest revolutions in spine, but in the planning of the process, there was no consideration for Medicare patients on the protocol, and that was the beginning of the whole complete mishap or disaster for Charité, because even today, many, many carriers will not cover this device because of the fact that they think it's investigational. Kyphoplasty was able to rise above theirs and have been successful, and coblation is still trying to define its place in the marketplace with meeting the same investigational claims and denial of coverages. So my point here is that it's very, very important from the very onset to think about reimbursement, not as an afterthought, but as a pre-planning event. Next slide, please, Rob. So in the planning, what are the things that you want to think about from a pre-IDE or pre-outcome study or pre-post-market study, if you will, planning? Well, you want to look at the functional and the whole functional biomaterial and the procedure analysis to define where this fits in the mainstream of what's being done today. You want to investigate the opportunities not only for the payment of professional and facility services under the strategy, but even more importantly, is there any opportunity through pass-through codes for codes, for instance, on the outpatient basis or add-on payments on the inpatient side. I can tell you that in this day and time, more than ever, and it will only become more and more imperative as we move towards the full implementation of healthcare reform, data is key. So, and many of these insurance carriers are now not only denying coverage and inhibiting the process of some of the innovation to get through to the consumer because of a lack of what they have determined of proper utilization and support in terms of patient outcomes and publications and efficacy in the spine community. Next slide, please. So a sample of a couple of case reports from some devices we were involved with. In the pre-planning process for submitting an IDE to the FDA for a new device for Rainier, we actually were able to help the company proactively resolve many of their obstacles that would have impaired reimbursement by seeking out advice from medical directors from around the country to evaluate a protocol prior to actually submitting it to the FDA and working out the nuances of the economic modeling to better prepare the submission and take into consideration any issues that might have impacted the reimbursement in the whole regulatory process. The same is true with a Medica who undertook the same type of due diligence to support their product. Next slide, please. So part of what a sponsor is always looking for is how do you lower cost and accelerate enrollment, because accelerated enrollment means time to market that much sooner. A very good strategy and that many companies are starting to utilize are combining United States sites with sites outside this country. One of the criteria you have to be careful of is how do you use that data and also getting the FDA to allow the use of that data. The site of the country and the selection of sites, each country has its own registration requirements for not only getting the product in, but also for being able to commercialize it under their system. There are FDA requirements, and in the interim, while you get through those, there's tremendous opportunity for commercializing outside the United States with a CE mark. It's a much, much smaller number of cases and getting to market and generating revenue. The monitoring and the audits are different from place to place, and again, you have to require them to follow company or country-specific guidelines. And paying for research, clinical services are also very different from the United States in many countries and country-specific. For instance, right now in the UK, they're moving towards a global package, which we've been doing here in the United States. But prior to that, it was almost impossible to do a global package payment strategy. Everything had to go through the national health system, which really slowed down enrollment. So these are just some of the issues that you have to think about to accelerate enrollment and lower costs. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the site selection is the most important. There has to be a whole process where you pre-qualify the site's participation and quantify what they actually will be able to deliver in terms of the enrollment. And that comes from data mining, looking at their prior history, researching their any history they have with the FDA, their infrastructure. All of these components are key. Next slide, please. Marketing strategies for patient recruitment are multi-focused. Education is a huge driver. Data mining, community outreach. A very effective tool is print and online advertising, which usually sponsors will help you, and effectively using the advertising to maximize the exposure for attracting patients. Social media has now become a very, very large force in recruiting patients for clinical trials, and even groups now are identifying databases of patients that you could opt into to meet your needs. Next slide, please, Rob. Post-market, you've got a lot of work to do after you get through the FDA, I have to tell you, because you've got to be able to train the sales forces and develop tools for distributing to facilities and physicians on reimbursement. A lot of companies will implement hotline support services for pre-auth and answering questions for sales and facilities. There has to be a credentialing program put together for a lot of these new devices or technology that will be used to present to payers as well as to sustain a long utilization pattern in the industry. Key message here is never stop collecting your data. It is not an event, it's a process. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the work goes on. You've got to, and if you're really proactively working your markets and looking at opportunities for utilization, you've got to regionally develop programs around your key sites and constantly educate the physicians, the hospitals, and the payers in those communities. Reimbursement and coverage decisions are regional, they're not national, and it's very important that you develop relationships with the payers in those sites, around the sites where you've done the services, and then you're also going on to coverage and implementation, sales. Next slide, please, Rob. So finding the right CRO is critical. It's about credentials, services, staffing, and management, their experience in the spine industry, how many studies they've successfully brought to market, the culture of that CRO and how they work, how do they handle, or can they support multitudes, vertically multitudes of services, or are they more departmental, if you will, focused in terms of what they offer? So our belief is with the right CRO that you can really accelerate your time to market and also collectively as a team mitigate the issues of budget and compliance to effectively get to the optimal market strategy and entry. Next slide. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Marcy. Very detailed, informative presentation. Greatly appreciate it. We're now going to begin the Q&A portion of the program. As a reminder for our attendees, you can submit your questions by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Before I get into our first question, certainly want to direct you to Marcy's contact information on this final slide and encourage you to certainly contact her directly with any questions, feedback, thoughts, whatever it is she's, I'm sure will be extremely receptive to any questions you have about the program or anything else that comes to mind. So first question, this participant is with a company that's bringing to market a new device that both identifies back disorders and measures efficacy of treatment. It uses sound waves. They know that they can get this new device under a 510K predicate device category, but want some help in how they should approach the reimbursement side.
Okay, well that's a good question, and you know, as I alluded to in my presentation, really the reimbursement side needs to be part of the whole strategy of the regulatory approval and that whole process. It's a proactive planning, so we would recommend that a whole analysis of competitive or similar products in the market would be done. Guidelines for how they address reimbursement would be put together. How would they approve through the FDA process? And then a plan, if you will, outlining a pathway to successfully meeting the needs of your 510K. Now 510K applications in some instances require almost as much data as a IDE clinical trial. So we have to be sensitive to that. And so I would suggest that an analysis of the device, how are we going to categorize it, how do we define sound waves, and does that mean we're tied to an imaging type reimbursement structure, or there are opportunities to look for other structures? How do we want to classify it? Do we want to look towards add-on strategies for facilities that might buy this device, or it is a professional, physician-only type reimbursement model? All of that needs to be part of the whole planning process for the phase of approval from a commercialization, FDA, and market entry strategy.
Thank you, Marcy. Let's move right into the next question. This person says that their company is in the midst of the final stages of enrollment for a new biologic, but they're struggling with enrollment and patient follow-up, and this problem is really impacting their timeline. Can you offer some strategies or solutions that they can use to resolve this issue?
Yeah, this is a very common problem with trials, especially if they've been going on for quite some time. And so in terms of accelerating enrollment, what might be very effective for this company is to identify some strategies for launching some marketing and advertising in their communities with ads strategically placed to maximize readership, and to be able to add on to the patients that they're already enrolling. Social media campaigns have been very effective now for being able to bring patients into a clinical trial using Twitter and all of the other modalities out there. The other thing is to look at maybe going back through some of the data of the principal investigator sites and see if there's ways to leverage information to their referring bases of physicians who have sent patients that might be key specialties that could have the potential to refer. In terms of the patient follow-up, this again is another common problem, and in these cases, a lot of times what's necessary is to create some type of incentive program to encourage the patients to come in, either in a gift card basis for a visit, or in some instances, if it's really critical, a company may have to look at sending a nurse or a clinical research coordinator or someone qualified to the patient's home or a central location to get the follow-up data that's needed.
Thank you. Let's get to we'll get to a couple more questions, and then I want to make sure that Marcy has a few moments for some final thoughts before we conclude. We've got a few more to get to. This one, this person says that their biggest challenge in bringing the company's new devices to market is site selection. They find themselves looking for the patients that the principal investigators promised when we signed them up. Is there a way to prevent, I guess, this obstacle in the future?
Absolutely. I think before you sign up a site, it's absolutely imperative that you have a due diligence process to be able to quantify the capabilities of the site as well as the potential for enrollment. And as I mentioned to you earlier, there's a whole checklist of things to go through. It takes on-site data mining as well as interviews with the principal investigator, checking FDA history and that sort of thing, but that will eliminate a lot of the enrollment surprises you find that traditionally come about when you select a site solely on the basis of just discussions with the physician.
Thank you. We'll do one more question, and then we'll wrap up the program. I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but it sounds like this participant wants you to get into a little more about how to approach reimbursement and when and what is required.
Reimbursement needs to start from the very beginning. The minute you come up with a product, or even if you're thinking about a new product you want to bring to the market, you need to be thinking about reimbursement, and you need to be thinking about data to support it. The evidence-based protocol requirements by insurance companies are only becoming more and more demanding, and you can't start too soon thinking about reimbursement. And it's not a one-time event because things change. With utilization, carriers change their positions and change their fee schedules. So from the very beginning, you need to be able to have a very proactive approach to reimbursement that starts with the planning phase, takes you through the clinical trial. We actually do payer education at 6-month data points, kind of starting to educate payers around the sites, around the network of insurance companies and various sites where the clinical trial sites are based. On a general basis, obviously not wanting to compromise any data, but just start the whole education process, and then that becomes a continual process as you carry through the guidelines and the enrollment and then the follow-up period. There's also the involvement early on of, if it's very, very innovative, of taking the protocol to the Medicare Tech Committee to have them look at it and be able to quantify and identify any obstacles for reimbursement. So the process starts with a thought and carries on for the life of the product.
Thank you very much, Marcy. I'm going to ask you to share some final thoughts in just a moment, but again, certainly want to encourage all our attendees. We'll certainly want to thank them for joining us, but definitely want to encourage them again to reach out to you directly with your contact information on this final slide here, and also encourage them to mark their calendars 5 weeks from now on Wednesday, March 20th, same start time of 10:30 Pacific. We will be presenting another webinar on how to effectively market spine centers and spine surgeons. Everyone who registers today, when I send out the follow-up email to the program, that will include a link to download the recording of today's program in case you want to listen to it again or share it with colleagues. I'll include that information about how to register now for that program. Again, how to effectively market spine centers and spine surgeons to be taking place Wednesday, March 20th. Marcy, can I again, I'm going to ask you to share some final thoughts before we conclude.
Well, this is change always produces, some obstacles, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And I think we're going through a very challenging time, particularly in spine, with a higher level of scrutiny and some need for the FDA to be able to sort out their internal issues to streamline the whole process of commercialization of new products. So I would encourage everyone to think outside the box, be open to new opportunities and new pathways for getting to where you need to with your products, and also always be very, very cognizant that whatever obstacles come along, that the whole process of collecting data and demonstrating efficacy and medical evidence is ultimately the key to the success of the commercialization of new products. So I appreciate everyone joining, and I look forward to hearing from any of you if you need any assistance whatsoever.
Thank you again, Marcy, very much again for a great presentation, certainly for addressing a number of questions. I again want to thank all the folks who took some time out of their day to join us, and I definitely hope that many, if not all of you, will join us next month for our next webinar. With that, this concludes today's program. I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.